Upstate Medical University in Syracuse, New York invites you to be the informed patient with the podcast that features experts from Central New York's only academic medical center. I'm your host, Amber Smith. People with disabilities navigate a world that was not built for them. A new book offers a window into how scholars, artists, writers, and thought leaders with disabilities understand what it means to flourish. One of the editors of The Art of Flourishing is here with me to talk about it. Liz Bowen is an assistant professor of bioethics and humanities at Upstate. Welcome to The Informed Patient, Dr. Bowen.
Thanks so much, Amber. I'm grateful to you for having me.
The introduction by you and your co-editors starts with a definition of disability. Can you tell us what disability means and who this book is for?
So the book starts with a definition of disability. It's a quote from one of the contributors to the book, Haben Germa, who is a deafblind lawyer and author, advocate, all around pretty incredible person, who suggests that we define disability as an opportunity for innovation. And what she means by that is disability is often a condition that prompts us to think, okay, if something can't be accomplished one way, what's another way to do it? And the reason we started the book with this particular definition is because I think for many of us who are in disability communities, identify as disabled, which I myself do for the record, this is a really familiar way of thinking about our experience. But for folks that are maybe less embedded in that experience or those communities, it might be kind of surprising, right? Like innovation is not a word that often we hear in proximity to disability. And I want to stress that this is just like one possible way of defining disability among many. Like there is just a whole world of scholarly and other public debate over the meaning of disability that, I think for the sake of this collection, no one of them really encapsulates everything that disability can mean and all the ways that it can be an occasion for thinking about the concept of flourishing, which is really at the heart of this book. So for example, the Americans with Disabilities Act definition of disability is a really common way that people like to think about it. It's a condition that affects various activities of daily living. And while that may be true in many cases, that definition doesn't quite capture the ways that if somebody has access to a whole range of social supports and adaptive devices, their activities of daily living might not be really impacted, right? And yet they might still identify as disabled or consider themselves part of a disability community. And so there's all these many circulating definitions that may capture some aspects of the experience or some aspects of the kind of social meaning of disability, but I think we kind of need all of them together to think about it in particular contexts.
I've heard some people say differently abled instead of disabled.
Yeah, which is a term I would say is among many disability communities, not all, I don't want to ever speak for everyone, but it's a term that a lot of people find not super descriptive of the experience of disability, mainly because it, I think the impulse behind it is a well-meaning one, which is to emphasize kind of human diversity, right? The idea that all bodies and minds are different from one another, and there's not necessarily a kind of value judgment that should be placed on any particular form of embodiment. But what it doesn't get at is the way that disability and being perceived as disabled, being treated as a person with a disability in a society that often discriminates against people with disabilities, like that is a particular experience that non-disabled people don't have, right? And so often when people are sort of insisting on being referred to either as a person with disability or a disabled person, these are also terms that are kind of contested and people may have different preferences about them. It's really to capture the fact that disability does shape the way that people move through the world and experience life among other people. And that's something worth naming and destigmatizing, right? It's not a bad thing to be disabled. It's a part of what it means for some of us.
Do you believe there's a heightened awareness about disability today?
I do. And it's yes and no, I guess it's a short answer. Part of what we talk about in the introduction to the book is the way in which social media has contributed to really a proliferation of first-person narratives of disability in many ways, in terms like ableism, for example, becoming kind of more common in the mainstream. People have heard of this term in a way that they hadn't even 5 or 10 years ago. And, I think in addition to this kind of more recent proliferation of people talking about what it is like to be disabled with like larger platforms than they've ever had before. Something I also think is a pretty significant kind of marker of our historical moment is that the Americans with Disabilities Act is 35 years old. The ADA and I are actually the same age. And what that meant at a kind of social and cultural level is that, from 1990 onward, there was encoded into US law anyway, basic expectation that people with disabilities are entitled to the same access to the same spaces, to the same kinds of social participation, the same degree of civic participation as everybody else. And that wasn't the case prior to that moment. And so for my generation, for example, that means that we grew up with a whole different set of expectations about where disabled people belong. And we grew up with much more diverse classrooms and later workplaces. And that means we're interacting with, hearing from people who are often very different from us in a way that just, it's not to say the ADA is perfect and has guaranteed access to everything, because it certainly has not, but there have been major ramifications of this being kind of a baseline social expectation in a way that I think, parallel with the rise of social media and people, gaining access to kinds of platforms that they didn't have before. Those things sort of combined, I guess, to create just a kind of more pervasive sense that disability is a component of human diversity, rather than something that is, should be kind of stigmatized and not talked about.
You use the word ableism. Can you explain what that is?
Yeah. Again, there's a lot of possible definitions, but a super simple one is it's the basic kind of assumption that having a typical body or a quote unquote normal body or mind is preferable, more valuable than an atypical body or mind. And then all of the various kind of social ramifications of that assumption, which often results in things like discrimination and, lack of access to full participation in a society.
This is Upstate's The Informed Patient podcast. I'm your host, Amber Smith. I'm talking with Dr. Liz Bowen, an assistant professor of bioethics and humanities at Upstate, who is co-editor of a new book called The Art of Flourishing, Conversations on Disability. Now, some of the essays in the book talk about negative experiences with healthcare. Can you describe some of what people with disabilities report?
We could talk about this for like the whole time we're together if we wanted to, but I'll try to be brief. This is really an area of research interest for me, something I think and teach a lot about. And so I'll just name a couple of sort of prime examples of ways that people with disabilities encounter or can encounter barriers in healthcare that other people might not. The first really major one is a concept called diagnostic overshadowing, which refers to this phenomenon, which isn't limited to disability. Actually, there's a number of ways in which this can play out, but essentially it's a phenomenon where somebody shows up to their healthcare provider with some kind of symptoms, and because they have a disability, a pre-existing diagnosis, whatever they have come to receive healthcare for is automatically interpreted through the lens of that disability. So to give you an example, somebody who has an intellectual disability or a developmental disability, like autism, for example, might present at their doctor's office with frequent kind of meltdowns. They seem really distressed. And their healthcare provider might look at them and say, okay, this is a person with autism. this is a behavioral issue. This is something that we need to devote our resources around behavioral healthcare to, when in fact, what that person is experiencing is a new medical condition that's causing them pain. And so if that patient is not being evaluated fully in a way that is more holistic than just through the lens of their pre-existing diagnosis, then they might receive delayed care, or they might not ever receive the care that they need. And this is a phenomenon that's been documented widely, and it happens in pretty much every category of disability: physical disability, psychiatric disability, even things like people who are overweight often experience the same thing, where everything is sort of interpreted through the lens of their weight, when that may or may not be the reason that they're having symptoms, right? So that's one major form of kind of cognitive bias that can come into play in healthcare. Another one is assumptions about quality of life. And this is a piece that I think our collection, The Art of Flourishing, is really part of our hope for this book, is that it will help sort of broaden our readers' imaginations around what might constitute a good life, a life that is lived in pursuit of flourishing. Because historically in medicine, there's a concept called the medical model of disability that disability activists and scholars have been sort of building for many decades now, which is this definition of disability that comes from medicine that sees disability as a deficit or something that needs to be fixed, or ideally cured within that model, right? What that model often produces when it's not thought about critically is this sense that disability is incompatible with a good quality of life. And this is often something that people with disabilities talk about in their encounters with healthcare providers, is that there's all kinds of assumptions about how whatever diagnoses they are living with impact their enjoyment of life. And there's even there's an amazing essay by a bioethicist and disability advocate named Bill Peace, who passed away several years ago, who was a wheelchair user, and he wrote about he had been in the hospital for a pressure sore, and it was a pretty difficult course of treatment. And at one point, he was encouraged by his physician to stop treatment and pursue end-of-life care for something that was not a fatal condition. And these kinds of stories are just really abundant within the disability advocacy communities. Again, I think part of what we're trying to do with this collection is really contest this idea that disability, and even the parts of it that might be hard, like very few of us who live with disabilities, I think, would deny that often it entails moments of hardship and even pain and fatigue and things that we don't enjoy, and yet our quality of life is, across every study in the book, like, people with disabilities report as high a quality of life as people without them. And so the stories that we're trying to tell with this collection are about what that really looks like, what people with disabilities think about when they think about flourishing in their own lives, and the conditions that need to be in place to support it.
Do you think that raising awareness is going to help reduce the number of negative experiences in medical offices, or are there other things that you'd like to see done?
Yes to both questions. The two examples that I just gave were both really about kind of forms of cognitive bias. And another big one that comes up a lot is infantilization, or the idea that somebody with a disability walks into the doctor's office and the doctor immediately assumes that they're not sexually active, for example, or they might not understand the information that is being given to them. They might, talk to the interpreter instead of the patient, right? These are all these forms of cognitive bias that come into play in healthcare encounters that I think are really important to teach about. I teach about them all the time when I work with med students and residents. And yeah, there are many things for which awareness, and then, the kind of follow up to awareness, which is action to disrupt those biases, can be really important. At the same time, there are also a lot of much kind of larger, more structural issues at play that affect people's access to healthcare that go way beyond bias. So lack of access to accessible medical facilities is a huge one. There currently is no sort of nationwide database that keeps track of healthcare facilities compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act. There have been sort of localized studies. So for example, there were a few in California that showed that only like 19% of primary care offices had adjustable exam tables, or you could move the height of it so that it's easier to transfer onto it if you're not standing. So there are major kind of physical barriers to accessibility in many, many healthcare facilities. And beyond that, of course, in recent months, the cuts to Medicaid are going to have major ramifications for people with disabilities' ability to access healthcare. There are many ramifications that we don't have time to get into right now, I don't think. But to give you one example, here in New York, our state office for people with developmental disabilities, OPWDD, relies on about $7 billion from Medicaid to support New Yorkers with developmental disabilities. And this includes support with medical needs and advocacy when people with disabilities are hospitalized, et cetera. And cuts to that funding are going to make those services just much more strapped, much less able to provide things people need, and will exacerbate the disparities that that population is already facing in the healthcare system. So there are these really kind of these major issues of material support and funding that are not really remedied with attitude changes or attention to bias, but what we really need, in fact, is our representatives and our leaders in government to fight for those supports. And the rest of us need to be making it known to our representatives that those supports are important to us.
I want to ask you about the book, which is divided into 6 sections with several essays in each of those sections. Can you tell us about the theme for each section?
Sure. So though I haven't talked really yet about the kind of process that produced this book, which was, it started out as a series of events that took place over the course of 3 years from 2019 to 2022, funded by the National Endowment for Humanities and organized by an institution called the Hastings Center, which is a premier bioethics institute founded in 1969 and really shaped the field of bioethics from the very beginning. I worked there as a postdoc before I came to Upstate and helped organize this series of events that really were initially conceived as exploring the relationship between technology and flourishing in the context of disability. So, really thinking about things like adaptive devices or various like medical technologies, reproductive technologies, things that can sometimes promote controversy in disability community, thinking about those things through the lens of flourishing. And over time, what we found was that frame was pretty limiting. And when we sort of brought our speakers together to create these conversations on that theme, they often wanted to talk about things that were much more sort of capacious and wide-ranging than technology. And so really we ended up reconceiving the series in collaboration with our speakers that we had invited, who came from a wide range of backgrounds and practices. Some were artists, some were disability studies scholars, some were public advocates, various kinds of public intellectuals, many types of disciplinary backgrounds, but all people who identify as disabled. And really the series kind of started taking shape around these verbs that people were thinking about as characterizing aspects of their flourishing. So things like belonging, navigating, enjoying, like the kinds of actions that we take in our lives that can bring about flourishing. So I can talk a little bit about each of them. The section that opens the book is on belonging. And that was the only event in our series, the conversation that produced this section was the only one that took place in person. All of the rest, because of the COVID pandemic, we had our first event and then everything was virtual after that. And that shaped some of the conversations in pretty major ways. But Belonging was an event that we held with 3 sort of prominent disabled scholars, intellectuals who all shared the experience of being deaf. Some of them were deaf-blind, some were deaf, and they were talking in sort of varied ways about their experiences in which part of flourishing was a sense of belonging within a community that deafness can bring, because deaf culture is widely considered to be a cultural group. This is something that has been one of the major interventions of disability activism and studies, has been this idea that the disability is a culture. It's not a diagnosis. It's not just a sort of bodily condition. It's a culture that can provide a sense of belonging and a sense of kind of creative possibility, right? And so that event was drawing on those panelists' experiences within deaf culture, and then how those experiences shaped their sense of belonging in a wider cultural context as well. So, to what extent does being a part of deaf culture, to what extent does it sort of bring you into connection or create barriers to belonging in a wider culture? If one seeks belonging within sort of non-deaf community, does that jeopardize one's status within deaf culture? So all of these kinds of questions about cultural positioning and belonging.
You're listening to Upstate's The Informed Patient podcast. I'm your host, Amber Smith. My guest is Dr. Liz Bowen. She's an assistant professor of bioethics and humanities at Upstate and co-editor of a new book called The Art of Flourishing: Conversations on Disability. You are a writer and a poet yourself. Was there one section that you identified with the most?
That is a hard question. They're all incredibly rich, and a number of them touch on this idea of disability as like a creatively generative position to occupy. So disrupting ableism with artful activism, our second chapter, and enjoying disability as a creative force, which is chapter 5. Both of those are guests for these conversations were artistic practitioners of various kinds, poets. We had a dancer. We had somebody who's engaged in a performance sense with works of art. And what I think really spoke to me about each of those chapters is the way that interdependence was kind of a guiding theme for really almost everyone that we had in conversation over the course of the series, but especially in terms of creative production. The ways that like disability often means that you have to be working really closely with others, and sort of to get back to that initial definition of disability, finding kind of innovative solutions and ways to work together that require working together and coming up with new ways of doing things, and that very act of like creating access for one another is creatively generative. I found that really moving and true to my own experience as an artist.
Let me ask you, what would it take to build a world in which everyone gets to exercise their own capabilities in ways that they find meaningful? And how far are we from something like that?
Yeah, so, I alluded to, I think, some of the ways that a world that fully supports all kinds of bodies and minds in their pursuit of flourishing would require some pretty fundamental shifts in the ways that we structure our society and our economy. And in a lot of ways, I do see in the present moment, at least in the US, we are moving away from some of those shifts being likely to occur in the near future. But that said, I am an optimist. I think if we don't have hope, I don't know what we have. So I do see, and amid things like the defunding of Medicaid, which are, in my opinion, going to have really, really disastrous effects for many people with disabilities, I also see amazing things happening at more local levels. For example, I see my students advocating for their needs and the needs of their peers in ways that I think my generation didn't even know that we could. Another takeaway from some of the conversations in the book is that disability communities have really always been kind of expert at finding ways to support one another amid our various systems failures to support them, which is not to say that we don't need those systems, but I think that those structures of support are really ongoing, and particularly in the wake of the pandemic, and have gained kind of, I think, wider recognition. And the pandemic, I think, showed in some ways what shifting our world might be able to look like. At the same time that early moment of 2020 was kind of, broadly terrifying and traumatizing. We did really collectively as a society decide, okay, we're going to change the way we do things in order to make it so that everyone can participate right now when things are radically different, right? Everything moved online. Part of what we talk about in the introduction to the book is how moving the series online made it more accessible in some ways to more people, but also kind of less accessible in other ways. And so that we do have precedents for making major changes to the ways that we conduct our everyday lives. And I think that's really important to hold on to. Even though in many ways, we now have decided things are shifting to the way they were before that. I think that kind of example, we could choose to conduct our lives and structure our societies in ways that are the most inclusive for the most people is something to hold on to. So I do have hope.
Well, Dr. Bowen, thank you so much for making time to tell us about your book.
Thank you, Amber.
My guest has been Liz Bowen from Upstate's Center for Bioethics and Humanities. The Informed Patient is a podcast covering health, science, and medicine, brought to you by Upstate Medical University in Syracuse, New York, and produced by Jim Howe, with sound engineering by Bill Brokel and graphic design by Dan Cameron. Find our archive of previous episodes at upstate.edu/informed. If you enjoyed this episode, please invite a friend to listen. You can also rate and review the Informed Patient podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you tune in. This is your host, Amber Smith, thanking you for listening.